Welcome. My name is Jeffrey Weidlinger, and I'm the director of the Raoul Wallenberg Institute. The Institute is named in honor of Raoul Wallenberg, a Michigan graduate from the class of 1935, who led the most successful rescue operation of Jews during the Holocaust and saved the lives of thousands of Hungarian Jews by issuing protective papers and sheltering families from deportation in safe houses throughout Budapest. The Institute, established less than 6 months ago, will study hatred directed against religious and ethnic communities, foster cross-cultural understanding, and elevate civic discourse through teaching, research, and public engagement by developing strategies to combat anti-Semitism, divisiveness, and discrimination. As part of this mission, we are sponsoring this conversation series with the goal of engaging students and the public with discussions about timely topics dealing with ethnic and religious hatred and tolerance. These moderated conversations invite scholars and practitioners to share their expertise with the campus community, to showcase diverse opinions, and to model open and respectful dialogue. Today's discussion, What is Genocide and Should We Name It?, will address the historical origins, legal implications, and profound impact of the terminology of genocide. Like all of our conversation series topics, today's subject is relevant to our contemporary world. The Simon Skote Center for the Prevention of Genocide's Early Warning Project, which assesses the risk of genocide around the world, warns of the imminent potential for genocide and mass atrocities in Chad, Sudan, Myanmar, Pakistan, India, Burkina Faso, Ethiopia, and Afghanistan, to name only those countries it identifies as most at risk. The International Court of Justice currently has genocide cases pending against Myanmar, Russia, and Israel, and the International Criminal Court has an arrest warrant out for President Omar al-Bashir of Sudan on the charge of genocide. The International Criminal Court has also issued warrants on the charges of crimes against humanity and war crimes, which I hope we will discuss today as well, in addition to genocide, against military and civilian officials from the Central African Republic, Israel, Libya, Mali, Russia, Sudan, and Uganda, including most famously against Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and Russian President Vladimir Putin. Just last week, the Philippines surrendered former President Rodrigo Duterte to the court to face trial on charges of crimes against humanity. And several cases against Hamas leaders were recently terminated following the deaths of the accused. In other words, the crime of genocide did not end with the liberation of the Nazi concentration camps, and its precise meaning and implications remain relevant and controversial today. I will take this opportunity, therefore, to remind you that the university's deep commitment to freedom of expression does not extend to the right to substantially disrupt or interfere with the lawful speech of others. You all have index cards available, and Miriam Mora, our managing director, has more if anybody needs them. And we encourage you to put your questions or comments on those cards, which we will collect in about a half an hour in order to guide the last segment of our discussion. So with that, I will invite our three panelists to come up to the stage, and as they're coming up, maybe once they sit down, I'll introduce them. So let's have everybody come up and sit down. And I will introduce them, beginning with, to my immediate right, Stephen Ratner. Professor Ratner is director of the Donia Human Rights Center here at the University of Michigan and Brino Sima Collegiate Professor of Law, as well as a member of the executive committee of the Raoul Wallenberg Institute. He teaches and writes on issues of human rights, territorial and ethnic-based dispute, and war and peace in the realm of international law. He has worked with the United Nations to investigate human rights violations in Sri Lanka and Ethiopia, as well as with the International Committee of the Red Cross in Geneva, and at the Office of the High Commission on National Minorities of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe at The Hague. To Steve's right is Yuri Kaparulin. Yuri is director of the Raphael Lemkin Center for Genocide Studies at Kherson State University in Ukraine, where he is also associate professor in the Department of National International Law and Law Enforcement. This year, he's a research fellow here at the Raoul Wallenberg Institute and is teaching a course on the crime of genocide in Ukraine. His work focuses on the history of political repression, human rights violations, crimes against humanity, and genocide in Eastern Europe. And he has previously served as a fellow at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C., at Yachad in Unum in Paris, and at the Center for Holocaust Studies at the Leibniz Institute for Contemporary History in Munich. And to Yuri's right is Linda Kinstler, who is visiting us from Harvard. And Linda is a journalist and junior fellow at the Harvard Society of Fellows. She is the author of Come to This Court and Cry, a really fantastic book which reflects on the criminal investigation of Herbert Sukers in Latvia and her own family's involvement with that case. She's written for the New York Times, the Atlantic, the Washington Post, the New Statesman, and many other publications on issues of genocide, memory, and crime. And her August 24 piece magazine titled The Bitter Fight Over the Meaning of Genocide. And if you haven't read it, I would highly recommend reading a fantastic summary of the current situation with genocide and genocide studies. So with that, let me begin with our panelists. And maybe I'll start just by having everybody talk a little bit about themselves, about how they came to this work, and about why they're sitting at this table now and their experiences working in the field. Maybe we'll start with Steve again.
Thanks, Jeff. Thanks for inviting me, and thanks to everybody for coming to talk about this a very important and pressing topic. I'm an international lawyer by training. My first job out of law school was at the U.S. State Department Office of the Legal Advisor, and at the time that I was in that office, the Cold War was coming to an end, and one of the issues that I got to work on was the resolution of the horrendous war going on in Cambodia, where the Khmer Rouge, which had killed about a fifth of the population, was fighting a battle against the government. And by participating in the negotiations that helped end that war in 1991, I was exposed for the first time to issues about genocide and crimes against humanity. A couple of years after that, I got involved with the US government and then eventually with the UN to setting up a international tribunal to try the Khmer Rouge leaders, which was set up, although it tried, in fact, very, very few of them. About a decade after that, I was invited by the UN to be part of a group of experts to advise the Secretary General about war crimes and crimes against humanity during the horrendous civil war in Sri Lanka. And we wrote a series of reports that brought attention to the crimes committed during that war. And then last year and the year before, I was involved again in another inquiry, this one created by the UN Human Rights Council, to look into war crimes during the conflict between Ethiopia and Tigray in the north of Ethiopia. And in all of those processes, we again had to investigate and identify whether certain acts met certain international definitions of crimes and what the consequences would be. So I've been involved in that. From a practical matter, I also do a lot of research and scholarship and teaching in the area as well.
Yuri?
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming to this panel today, and I'm really delighted to be between so great scholars. Yeah, I'm like recently young scholar in this field because I'm started to study a genocide topic just maybe a decade ago, and I really asked myself, so what I'm doing and why I'm doing this work, why I'm in this field. And when I learned and read the biography of Raphael Lemkin, the man who coined the term genocide, the concept of genocide, I found in his story that he was interested in topic actually from childhood, when he provided examples that he learned and read the book by Polish writer Henryk Sienkiewicz about persecution and mass killing of the Christians in Roman Empire. So, and I started to sort maybe, yeah, we are all from childhood, and maybe I also, maybe something happened with me in childhood, and I realized, okay, where I was born and where I grown up. So, and I was grown up in the city of Dnipropetrovsk, currently named Dnipro. It's very famous and one of the biggest cities in Ukraine. more than 1 million inhabitants, and it's famous as an aerospace center. It's like Houston in US, you know. And not only regular rocket engines were invented there, but also engines for nuclear weapon. For example, for the rocket named Satan, what possibly can destroy the whole globe in mass use. And I knew this story actually from my childhood, and I lived nearby the military airfield and I observed every day training flight of the jets. But I felt I live in peaceful country same time, you know. And the teachers at school since 1994 taught us, so Ukraine is peaceful country, we don't need a big army. This is why my father was sent to retired from military service, actually earlier than supposed to be. And we don't need nuclear weapon. And this year was Budapest Memorandum was signed up between Ukraine, Great Britain, US, and of course Russia. So I felt very peaceful. I'm very peaceful, and I believed we will live in peaceful country. What happened till next we can discuss more in our talk today. But yeah, I just wanted to mention, so I also grown up with these stories from World War II. It was a very famous topic, so we were learn a lot of stuff from World War II at school, and the events never named the genocides, what happened. It was by Soviet, old Soviet tradition, which was prior in my childhood school. It was named other words and other names, but I definitely came to this topic close at my university. And when I started to study Holocaust from my most progressive teachers who was pioneers actually, because it was closed topic in Soviet Ukraine. It was impossible to discuss any stuff about genocide, mass crimes, human rights violation during Soviet era. So I learned it recently. I mean, just few decades ago, first time, and I learned about the Holodomor, so our uniqueness in this story in Ukraine, and this is how I entered to this field. But the most important and maybe crucial moment for me, it was visiting the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. As Jeff said, it was my fellowship in Washington, D.C. through several months, and this is where I really deeply learned about the concept of genocide, Raphael Lemkin, his connection to Ukraine, my country, and yeah, so it's if very briefly, but maybe we can discuss more through Q&A. Yeah.
Linda.
Yeah, well, thank you, and thank you to you all for being here for this important discussion. Yeah, I guess I will try to offer an answer in brief, which is that I think the question that continues to concern me and has for some time has been the kind of difference between legal judgment and historical judgment, and the crimes that law does not recognize by its very nature. And I kind of approach the subject, you know, through my own family history as well. I have the unusual circumstance of being the descendant of both victims and perpetrators, and that's how I arrived at the subject of my book, which seeks to understand the nature of Holocaust denial in the present and how law, in this case domestic law, criminal law, can often exacerbate the very problems that it, you know, kind of seeks to protect and prevent. And so I never really answered those questions for myself in that book, and I was working as a journalist throughout Eastern Europe at the time that I was writing about it and studying and kind of acquainting myself with the world of international tribunals and their own logics. And now I'm kind of continuing to look into this subject as a journalist and as a scholar.
And let me stick with you, Linda,
Okay.
and ask you to tell us what genocide actually is, how the concept came into being, how it emerged to get incorporated into the United Nations Convention on the prevention and punishment of the crime of genocide. We've mentioned Raphael Lemkin a few times. I'm not sure everybody knows who he is, but maybe if you can give us a little bit of background. And maybe we have a slide. Yeah, the slide. Yeah.
So, yeah, you cannot speak about the origins of the term genocide without speaking about the creator of the term, Raphael Lemkin, who as a child survived pogroms himself, and this was kind of his earliest memory of violence against a people and kind of shaped him going forward. But what really a lot of people don't realize about the origins, about how he thought about this, was that as he was a young lawyer practicing in Lviv, he was concerned not only with like kind of local politics and organized violence, but also with discovering the Armenian genocide and the cover-up of that crime. And so he lost, I think, 49 members of his own family to the Holocaust, and kind of witnessing and surviving that event himself drove him to believe urgently that we needed to name this crime, right? Churchill said that genocide is the crime without a name, and Lemkin famously inserted himself into the halls of Nuremberg and tried with all his might to get the prosecuting Allied powers to include genocide in their list of charges against the Nazis, unsuccessfully in that instance. But then later in the Genocide Convention in 1948, we have it finally codified as an attempt to kind of destroy a people or nation, and we can talk about the various, the 5 different kinds of iterations of that crime.
Great. And maybe I'll turn to you, Steve, if you can tell us a little bit about, again, what genocide means, what the legal implications are of it. It's been prosecuted in the past.
Sure. There are many different understandings of genocide, but the one that I think we need to start with is the one that is in the convention that Linda just mentioned, which is the 1948 Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. We'll explain in a minute who that other man was. This is sort of the official-looking UN text, but I've got a sort of clearer version of a couple of the key articles. There's a lot of text up there, and I don't want to go into all of it. But really what I want to zero in on for just a few minutes is Article 2, which is the definition of genocide, the legal definition of genocide according to international law. And it is any of the following acts committed with the intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group as such. And then it lists these 5 horrible atrocities, from killing to bodily injury to preventing births and transferring the children. The thing that I really want to focus in on, and what makes genocide special, and some would say worse, a crime, a more serious crime than others, is that phrase, with the intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group as such. That little phrase has 2 key things that are worth looking at. First, it only applies to attempts to destroy certain kinds of groups, 4 that are mentioned. It doesn't apply to political groups, economic groups, social groups, gender-based groups. We'll talk about why that is and whether that makes sense later on today. But it's limited to those 4 categories. The second part is that it says there has to be an intent to destroy those groups in whole or in part, which means that the perpetrator has to not just want to kill a lot of people and not just intimidate the population, but actually destroy the group in whole or in part. Now, there's no doubt that during the 20th century, there have been mass atrocities that met this threshold. Armenia, the Holocaust, Rwanda, the Anfal by Saddam Hussein, parts of the Bosnian War, Darfur, the attack on the Maya in Guatemala. I don't even want to come up with a comprehensive list. Nevertheless, when we look at international prosecutions, there are actually very few prosecutions for genocide. The famous Nuremberg and Tokyo tribunals prosecuted a different set of crimes called crimes against humanity and war crimes, and we can talk more about that. It's a broader set of crimes. This was before the Genocide Convention, and they were not prosecuting the Axis leaders for that. The war crimes trials of the Bosnians and Rwandans by the UN tribunals, for the most part, the people were not convicted of genocide, although a handful of Bosnian leaders were convicted of genocide at Srebrenica, and the leadership in Rwanda were convicted because of the absolutely apparent nature of the genocide there. Instead, nearly all the people prosecuted internationally were prosecuted for these other crimes, crimes against humanity and war crimes. At the domestic level, we have sort of the same situation. There have been some prosecutions. Guatemala prosecuted a former general. Lithuania prosecuted some Soviet officials. There are a handful of others, but for the most part, there are not a lot of prosecutions. As far as the ICC goes, as Jeff mentioned, they have issued indictments, but only one for genocide, and that's former dictator of Sudan, Omar al-Bashir, for genocide in Darfur. The latest indictments have all been for these other sets of crimes. Just to cut to the chase, why so few prosecutions? It's because prosecutors and courts put a very high threshold on determining this intent to destroy. There has to be proof that it's the only reasonable inference of what the perpetrator was doing. And that means looking at exactly how the atrocities were carried out, what words were used by the governmental officials, what the state's policies were, how methodical it was, so that that's the only conclusion that can be reached. As I said, just killing for political or military reasons is not genocide under international law. I would just add, since Jeff talked about the International Court of Justice, which hears cases against states, no state has ever been found guilty of or responsible for committing genocide either. The closest that has happened is that Serbia was found responsible for failing to prevent genocide in Bosnia by not preventing its allies, the Bosnian Serbs, from carrying out the genocide at Srebrenica. And so there's never been a holding as far as the state goes. There are a number of cases in front of the World Court right now. They're not going to be decided for a number of years. And we will see whether there will be a change in that posture. But this seriousness with which prosecutors and international courts treat this idea of the intent has resulted in a fairly small number of prosecutions. And I think I'll just stop there.
All right, great. And maybe I'll kind of focus a little bit on some of the issues that you've raised, particularly that the crime of genocide privileges race, nation, ethnicity, and religion as the four groups that have to be targeted in genocide. So as you said, a mass killing of groups of people on the basis of gender, for instance, or political affiliation, or class does not constitute. And in that connection, I wonder if I can turn to Yuri and ask you a little bit about how that's played out in Ukraine, and in thinking in the way that Ukrainians have thought about the Holodomor, which is the starvation, the forced starvation of about 3.5 million people in Ukraine between 1932 and 1933. And maybe you can talk a little bit about that, and also why those four categories privilege above others. I believe the Soviet Union wanted class, or the Soviet Union fought against including economic class because the Soviet government was responsible for the mass murder of people on the basis of their class. So they didn't want that included in the definition. But Yuri?
Yes, thank you very much. It's really interesting question because before World War II, Lemkin himself, he discussed the possibility to include social group. And actually, political groups were included to the draft version of convention before it was adopted. But then it was excluded. And there are many contemporary studies on this. And maybe one of the scholars, most known scholars in this field, Anton Wentz, he said and provides in his research that the political groups were excluded by political reasons. Not all countries who are signed up convention wanted to be persecuted for genocide on this base. And it's actually happened in Mays in Soviet Union, just before World War II. It was a great purge in Soviet Union, took the life of millions of people. It was Holodomor, as you mentioned, in Ukrainian history. And other countries also had their own dark background. So it was simply excluded from final version. And as I said, social groups also were excluded by Lemkin himself, in fact. But scholars and even contemporary scholars, they are discussing this possibility to to add these groups or understand other groups as victims of genocide in academic level. So it's still debate. Some scholars said, and legal scholars said, so we no need, if its concept already works, so we no need to change anything. But we can discuss academically what kind of groups we can recognize victims of genocide. Some scholars agreed, who studied genocide, that any groups, in particular any group, can be group of victims of genocides. It's in broader sense. But returning back to the case of Holodomor in the history of Ukraine, we still have a debate. So mainly Holodomor we understand as an artificially created famine by Soviet government, which took lives of several millions of Ukrainians. And here we have a mainly ethnic focus. But current research shows us that not only Ukrainians, mainly, but not only were killed by this artificial famine, and other ethnic minorities in Ukraine, like ethnic Germans, ethnic Jews. Ukraine was, before the World War II, Ukraine was a really polyethnic state, much more than today. It's still a polyethnic state, but before World War II, there are much more ethnic minorities lived in Ukraine. And they also experienced Holodomor, and some of them died, some of them survived and recalled their experience later. In my research, in particular, I'm studying the Jewish experience during Holodomor, what was a topic for discussion today too. But in this case, we also have a debate about the social groups as a targets in this attack from Soviet government, because and this is the case what provides us understanding that sometimes the focus group and victims of genocide can have several identities. And crimes committed against them can be focused on them, not representatives of only one identity. And Holodomor also provides us perspective when people could be attacked for like a representative of Ukrainian nation, same time as a social class of kulaks, rich peasants who didn't want to accept collectivization policy in Soviet Union.
Thanks. Yeah, go ahead, Linda.
Yeah, intervene. I think, one of the things that I find often when we talk about genocide is that it very quickly becomes a conversation about legal particulars. And, when we're talking about which kinds of groups genocide recognizes or not, that's one dimension of it, right? And the other dimension of it is this kind of moral recognition, right? An affirmative judgment of genocide, such as in the Bosnia-Serbia case, what would that have done for the victims? And, in the piece that I wrote about this term, I was so struck by this one story that the lawyer Marko Milanovic told me about that moment in 2007 when the Bosnia-Serbia judgment came down, when the determination was that there was one episode of genocide at Srebrenica in this larger field of crimes against humanity and war crimes, and that there was one survivor at the Peace Palace that day, and when he heard the judges deliver that verdict, he stormed outside and tore up their ruling, because to him it was a complete kind of denial and abnegation of everything that he and that he had survived and that his family had not. And so I think that's kind of also what we're talking about here when we talk about what is genocide and should we name it.
Well, actually, on that, let's turn to the should we name it part. And I'll point out that many people realize that Nazis were prosecuted for genocide at Nuremberg. Robert Jackson, who was the chief prosecutor, Justice Jackson, rejected the concept of genocide, didn't think it was a useful concept, and instead prosecuted the Nazis on the basis of crimes against humanity and crimes against war. Yet today, genocide has become really the most heinous of crimes in popular mindset, I think. And it's, I was recently giving a talk and somebody said to me afterwards that she values every human life. And so in her mind, the killing of a single person is genocide. And I think that's just an interesting expansion of the term. So maybe I can ask you to reflect on the differences between the terminology of crimes against humanity and the meaning of crimes against humanity and genocide, and I guess ask that question. Should we name it? Is it a useful concept? Was Lemkin right or not? Or was Jackson right? And Steve, want to take a stab?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're really zeroing on one of the hardest moral questions here, and whether there is something distinctive about genocide. We know legally there's a distinctiveness, but we also know that legal definition is a political compromise where the Soviets simply would not include political groups as protected groups so that they could not be accused of genocide against the many victims of Stalin's purges. And as Jeff pointed out, it is called the crime of crimes by some people. On the other hand, we do have other international crimes. This idea of crimes against humanity is basically large-scale attacks on civilians, including murder, torture, enslavement, disappearances, that are part of a large-scale attack on civilians, but they don't require that special intent to destroy. And so they're easier to prove. And that's why most of the convictions have been for atrocities at that scale have been for crimes against humanity. So it's really on the one hand or on the other hand. On the one hand, why should killing these special groups be worse than wiping out economic, social, cultural groups? I mean, we're all people of equal worth, regardless of the group affiliation. That's a sort of cosmopolitan philosophy idea. But then, on the other hand, you've got this idea that there's something worse about killing based on some immutable feature of the group, although in this day and age, what's immutable is, of course, up for debate. And that something is lost to the society when a group is destroyed in whole or in part. That's what philosophers kind of call communitarian thinking. And I confess I'm kind of caught on this issue. I think there is a need to acknowledge the particular evil of actions based on discrimination, and to single out things like the Holocaust with a special word. But on the other hand, can we really say that the Khmer Rouge's extermination or all the acts in Bosnia that were not genocide or Stalin's liquidation of the kulaks is less bad? And so there is an arbitrariness to this definition which suggests that we should be very careful about invoking it because it's really not anything that is worse than the other sorts of crimes that are recognized and used. So those are my initial thoughts.
Anyone else want to answer?
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
I mean, I think I agree on many elements, and I think, the robustness of the debate over genocide today shows that it is a useful term, that it has not, I think often people are saying, oh, maybe this term has run out of steam. I think, in fact, no, like the fact that we are debating over what it means and how it should be applied shows the strength of it and that it is, doing really important descriptive work. I think when we talk about, should we name it, we're actually asking different questions. We're saying, what do we want law to do? What would naming it do, right? It would, on the one hand, perhaps allow us to prosecute the perpetrators of genocide, perhaps, or it would allow us to deliver some kind of very sought-after recognitions to victims of genocide around the world. And I think, if you talk to lawyers, they'll say, some of them will say, how could this have been elevated to be the crime of crimes, right? Above crimes against humanity and war crimes, that this is a kind of artificial elevation of genocide. And we can perhaps debate that. And I think, there are meaningful efforts right now to close this supposed intent loophole, and to, widen the meaning of intent, perhaps. And I think, there was this dissenting opinion from the ICJ, from the ad hoc judge, who said, when we are saying that a genocide is not taking place, this was in the ICJ case pertaining to Germany. That you mentioned.
ICJ is International Court of Justice.
Yes. And this was a dissenting opinion that said, there are none who are so blind as those who will not see. And I think oftentimes when we talk about genocide, it often takes a kind of plain and simple truth to make us aware of what we're really talking about.
Brief edition. So it's a great book by Philip Sands, a Great Britain legal scholar who wrote the book East-West Street about two lawyers, Raphael Lemkin and Gerd Lauterpacht. And from this book, he described their biography since they're studying at the university at Lviv in right, yes, Gerslautersprach, yeah. So the author, Philip Sands, describes the both biography since they started to study the law in the University of Lviv in contemporary Ukraine. And you really, when you read this book, you really feel the author was more interested in the concept of crime against humanity, because he thought it's more usable, it's more universal, because looking for this intent, the special intent in committed crime, it's often can like just stop persecution, because it's not too easy to do. And as Jeff mentioned, persecutors in Nuremberg process, they never persecute for genocide, and even persecutors in Germany and in their internal courts, they never persecute Nazi criminals for genocide. They simply use their domestic criminal code, and they used like punishment for crime in general, according to this criminal code. So yeah, when we should or not to use the term genocide, I would say, as we understand genocide mainly legally, we definitely can use it in legal sphere, but we know that historians use this term in their research according to historical events. Psychologists used it in their practice, analyzing historical trauma or other issues. And sometimes we also can hear the term genocide, and this may be most appropriate way, not appropriate way to use. In some conspiracy theories, some people use the genocide during the COVID pandemic, so that it's some kind of conspiracy theory, and it's global genocide. So sometimes genocide is an appropriate term, but in some cases it's simply battle word, you know. So what can provoke aggression and even fights, you know.
Let me, answer my own question on should we name it, because I also teach about genocide, and in the course that I teach on the Holocaust, I have a whole lecture where I talk about the term, and I have for many years argued against it, that I don't think it's right to privilege the murder of people on the basis, or to say it's any worse or any different to kill people on the basis of race, ethnicity, or religion, that to people on the basis of, say, sexual identity, gender identity, because of their glasses, or just to pick every 10th person, seems to me to be an equal crime. And I have a lot of trouble with that, because also it solidifies the notion of those groups, that all of these groups, race, ethnicity, religion, are invented groups. And it solidifies them to recognize that these are invented categories. And maybe I'll switch the microphones. I have to turn this one off, though. Well, actually, while I'm doing that, maybe I think I've made my point, but I'll turn to another question, which is also related to what Linda said, which is what purpose the term serves. And somebody, in one of the questions, somebody said, can we have any real conversation once the word genocide has been used? So on one hand, it serves a purpose to perhaps to give groups legitimate. Some say that every nation needs genocide to have come out of, and on the other hand, is a conversation stopper. So,
yeah. Thanks, Jeff. I mean, I think that Linda has phrased this put the question exactly the right way, which is law is not this abstract thing. It's got a purpose. And so, what is the purpose? Should we name it? Means why should we name it? What's the point of naming something genocide as opposed to naming it a war crime, or naming it a crime against humanity, or naming it torture, or naming it just murder, like the Nazis who were prosecuted by the Germans in the Auschwitz trials in Germany? They were prosecuted for murder, not for genocide. And to me, the purpose of this exercise, and this is from my own experience, is it's instrumental. It's to try to get the atrocities to stop. It's to try to prevent them from happening again. It's to try to have accountability for perpetrators. It's to try to provide relief to the victims. And the question is, does naming something genocide contribute to that end or detract from that end? And if I can, is this an okay? I mean, my own sort of skepticism, which I share, is from some personal experience about opportunistic uses of genocide. So Jeff mentioned I was on a couple of UN bodies investigating atrocities during the civil wars in Sri Lanka and in Ethiopia. And in both of those cases, when our group was investigating the atrocities and trying to figure out what kind of crimes they were under international law, we were approached by diaspora groups of the victims who wanted us to say that their kindred back home were the victims of genocide. Let me be more specific. In the case of Sri Lanka, it was Tamil diaspora groups. In the case of Ethiopia, it was Tigrayans, Amhara, Oromo diaspora groups. And they approached us because they wanted to make sure that their group was identified as a victim of genocide. Perhaps they thought it would get more attention to their cause. But it was also clear that they also wanted to make sure that our report didn't name any other groups as victims of genocide. And in my view, I think their motivation was, I don't want to sound cynical here, but I think their motivation was to have the world see them the same way as they would say the victims of the Holocaust or the Rwandan genocide, and to put them in that group. And maybe even more skeptically, to serve as a justification for their own actions against those committing crimes against them. And this is not just hypothetical. As Yuri was intimating a moment ago, we have leaders who have used the term genocide for very pernicious purposes. Paul Kagame in Rwanda has used the legacy of the Rwanda genocide to maintain a grip on power. Hun Sen in Cambodia, the same thing. And Vladimir Putin used the word as a pretext for the invasion of Ukraine, and that's why Ukraine is suing Russia in the ICJ. So there are many, many downsides and opportunistic uses of genocide that one sees with these other instances and maybe in other conflicts as well.
Yeah, maybe a few words. It's interesting, how genocide can be in use in the political sphere, and I'm trying to be careful to protect this approach because on the one hand, we understand that sometimes politicians try to manipulate with audience, with the electorate, using genocide just to get some political points. Sometimes, and in my country, we have like a striking case between Ukraine and Poland, discussion about events in the Volyn region in the western Ukraine, what happened in 1943 when Ukrainian nationalists and Ukrainian insurgent army partisans committed mass killing of local ethnic Polish population. And from Ukrainian perspective, officially, it's like events of tragedy, what happened on the territory of Ukraine. In the Poland, it was more interpreted as a genocide. And so we have, until today, we have debates. I'm happy we're on the way to reconciliation of this process. And just recently, Poland and Ukraine agreed to organize a process of exhumation and creation of some kind of policy of memory between both countries, just prevent the future fights between politicians, but possibly nations. And so these fights for the past, it's one way, but another aspect is when politicians try to use the term genocide according to contemporary events. And for example, President Biden, from the first days of full-scale invasion to Ukraine, clearly said after the crimes in Bucha and other sites in Ukraine was discovered that Russia committed genocide. And but today we see total change from this perspective. Just yesterday, I read in the news that U.S. side was withdrawn from the group persecuting and persecuted Russian crimes in Ukraine and created in the European Union. And yeah, I think the language and term of genocide will change in the official language of US politicians now.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I think it's, I'm interested in your kind of stance on the term, and I do think that, that Lemkin's original vision of genocide, we should note, was much more expansive than the one that we have today, right? That he wanted a definition of genocide that included cultural genocide, the kind of wiping out of libraries, art, language, this kind of much more expansive vision, which of course did not make it into the UN Convention. And I do think that is a specific crime that deserves to be named. I think one thing, that has been kind of addressed is that the problem is that genocide, the perception of genocide as, the crime of crimes, somehow has the effect of, or in public perception of somehow weakening war crimes and crimes against humanity, as if those are somehow not as bad. And we know from our own experience that people are much less likely. States commit war crimes all the time, and they don't necessarily generate as many headlines as an accusation of genocide might. And I think what I am observing is there's this really fascinating debate going on right now about international law and its purposes. And, there's one camp that sees precisely the way that the UN Genocide Convention was put together as an example of how law can obscure state crimes and how international law can be a tool of violence and injustice. And another camp, that kind of idealists from which this human rights movement came, that really see it as a tool for prevention. And we're kind of living in, or I kind of feel torn in between these two camps, right? And we can acknowledge that international law has, served the purposes of many ill actors, and also that there is this vision of hope inside of it, the kind of vision, a utopian vision of a better world.
Let me turn to some of the other questions. One of them, well, actually several questions relate to this, and I don't think it's all that surprising that people are asking this question. Just a few weeks ago, we had a discussion here on why it's so difficult to talk about Israel and Palestine, and talked about the emotional relationship that a lot of people have to that region, the familiarity that people have with the region, and the region's role in the three major Abrahamic religions, and the way that it's so central to that, and so people feel very strongly about that issue. So one of the questions, the genocide scholar Raz Segal famously or infamously referred to the Gaza war as a textbook case of genocide, which I believe he said in November, about a month after, or even less, after the war had begun. So I want to get your thoughts on the situation in Gaza and its relationship to genocide as a textbook case. Start with you, maybe, Steve.
So sure, I think I'll answer that question on two levels. First, sort of the narrow legal question of whether Israel has committed genocide in Gaza. I'm not going to give an answer today, but it actually depends on how a future court deals with the question of whether Israel is responsible for genocidal intent of one soldier, because that soldier works for the Israeli government, and in which case we might say the court might conclude that Israel has the same intent as its soldier, or whether a court decides that there has to be a sort of state policy of this intent to destroy. And there's different facts about those. There might be a lot more evidence of the first, I think there is, than there is of the second. And because, again, the court is not just going to look at the words of a few politicians to decide if there's a state policy of genocide. It's going to look at how the war was carried out in great detail. And so I happen to disagree that this is a textbook case. I think it's a really hard case if we're looking at whether there is an Israeli policy of intending to destroy the people of the Palestinian population. The larger question, though, gets back to my earlier point, which is this whole word ends up being a sideshow that diverts us from the larger questions that there are terrible atrocities that started on before, depending on your views, October 7th, and have continued to the present day. And those are mostly not genocide, but they're still horrible. They've still led to the deaths of tens of thousands of people in Gaza. And whether they are genocide to me is not really important. And when we channel the debate into that discussion, we're missing out on the gravity of what's happening and the solution for it.
Anybody want to add or suggest an alternative? Maybe I'll ask another question. There was another question. Do you want to?
Yeah,
ahead, Linda.
I mean, I think what was when I was posing this question to international lawyers, you know, it was about 7 months ago, and it was after Raz published that piece, and after Omer Bartov weighed in. At first, Omer said that if the IDF goes into Rafah, then we will have definitive evidence that this is a genocide in motion, and then they did. And then he said, okay, here we are, this is the case for genocide. I think the consensus among scholars is now we are almost beyond the question of whether there are genocidal acts that have been perpetrated in Gaza. There is, we know that there have been. Whether the ICJ makes the same determination, we can't know. We can't know into the minds of judges. However, I think there's reason, and I'm curious what others think about the fact that the Bosnia decision will be a likely precedent, in that there will be a determination that perhaps there was one or two genocidal events that we can point to, but the overall decision is not going to deliver the much sought after recognition for these crimes. So yeah, I very much agree, and I think it's an important debate to have, but it also obscures the fact that every day there's a classroom of Palestinian children that have been killed since the start of this conflict.
There's another question that says, do you consider what's happening today genocide? That may be referring to the situation in Gaza. It may also be referring to the situation in the Central African Republic, in Libya, in Mali, in Sudan. But I'm going to ask it also about Russia and Ukraine, which is we have an expert here on it. And maybe, I don't know if Yuri wants to answer, if somebody else wants to answer, but the extent to which Russia's actions in Ukraine can be considered genocide. Same sort of question.
Maybe first I will add a couple words about the Gaza case. So I want to provide the perspective from scholars who criticize the concept of genocide, and for example, Dirk Moses, contemporary scholar, and also Donald Bloxham in their recent books discussed that maybe we no need to fixate on the genocide. The crime of civil destruction can be much more destructive in some times, but it doesn't mean it's less crime than genocide. So for me, my expertise is not on Israeli-Palestinian conflict and recent events in Gaza, but the question here, I think, interested me too. It's if we will have a political will to organize persecution and on this case, in general. So it's a question if it will be some court at all on this, and if it will be a court, so what kind of model? It can be ad hoc, international court model, some national persecution. So it's also practical challenging questions what potentially can be raised related to Gaza. And returning back to the discussion about genocide committed in Ukraine, I was very, very careful on the start of the full-scale invasion using the genocide, but our parliament, Verkhovna Rada, almost immediately, as I said, in March and April, adopted the resolution, special resolution, recognized Russian full-scale invasion and crimes committed in Ukraine as a genocidal actions. And then it was a discussion between Ukrainian international legal scholars, historians on this topic. And today we have a result of this research, and some scholars agreed it has all signs of genocide, but we definitely, before we will name the events genocide, I think we need persecution and special court on this, and only after we receive court decision on this, we can freely name it genocide. But now I prefer use term signs of genocide or kind of this. Anyway, for me, it's not so principled to recognize the crime of genocide. If all criminals will be persecuted and punished for war crimes or crimes against humanity, I'll be satisfied, as many Ukrainians too. And I just want to remember that genocide in international fair, it's not less crime than crime against humanity or war crimes. And to persecuting and punishing for war crimes and crimes against humanity is maybe practically best way, but same time it doesn't mean we can't to persecute for genocide. And for genocide potentially could be persecuted and punished the highest level leaders who decided to commit aggression. And if we will find some special intent, we can punish some people for genocide. But in most cases, I believe it will be war crimes.
Let me
just add just one coda. I mean, I think maybe one, perhaps one presumption of the last couple of questions is that if something is labeled as genocide, that there's some kind of duty on other states to intervene. And if I could just put up the convention for a moment, it's actually not the case. The Genocide Convention has a very weak article, the last one. Any contracting party may call on the competent organs of the UN to take actions under the Charter as they deem necessary. There's no requirement on the UN to do anything. There's no requirement on outside states to invade and stop the genocide. So perhaps those who approached our commissions of inquiry thought that if we named what was done to the Tigrayans or the Tamils as genocide, that it would therefore give a license to the UN. But in fact, legally, it doesn't change the story at all. And in fact, unfortunately, even when things aren't identified as genocide, the international reaction has been pretty lame, as we know from both Bosnia and Rwanda.
And maybe I'll just add and push back a little bit on the Gaza question and to kind of express some of the reasons why I think people are so upset by that comparison. Of course, as both of you have mentioned, taking the Srebrenica case aside, no country has been accused of genocide or has been convicted of genocide before, and that there is a certain irony of convicting the people who are the descendants of the victims of the greatest genocide of genocide. And then the comparison between the genocide that the descendants of the victims of the Holocaust are being accused of, comparing the Holocaust to that genocide. Of course, the Holocaust did not begin with a major Jewish attack against Germany, in which 1,200 Germans, however many, were massacred and sexually assaulted and raped and killed in their beds. That's not how the Holocaust began. The Jews of the Warsaw Ghetto were not holding German hostages, nor were the Jews in concentration camps holding German hostages. So I think for those reasons, it's difficult for a lot of people to accept that there's any comparison between the actions of the State of Israel now and the actions of other perpetrators of genocide. I just wonder how, recognizing that neither of you went that far, but how you respond to those accusations or to those comments.
Yeah, I mean, I think, irony is one way of putting it. Irony is not a protection in any way from the commission of a crime. And we know that, victims can become perpetrators and perpetrators can become victims, and there's no, magic shield that protects anyone. And I think, it's an emotional issue, and I think this gets back to this question of does the conversation just stop when we talk about genocide? Because what is the textbook case of genocide? It is the Holocaust. And when you talk about genocide, you immediately conjure up the architecture of the Holocaust and the very particular mode of mechanized killing, systematic killing of the Jewish people. But that's why this document that we have inherited is so difficult, I think, because it doesn't say anything about how it begins. And the drafters who are creating it deliberately left it up to the interpreters with the intent and with other elements of the convention because they didn't want to iron it out at that moment because it would be so politically difficult to do so. Yeah, and I think I'm totally fascinated by why we keep turning to international law as a place that's going to, save us in some ways from ourselves, that's going to provide us with answers that we haven't found in other places. So that's an attempt at an answer.
I guess I would just add, I think for the international lawyer in me, everything you said is completely irrelevant to whether or not any crime, genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes, was committed. Whatever started this war, whether it was October 7th or for some people the occupation before it, is irrelevant to whether one side or the other has committed violations of international humanitarian law. I would say, as a moral matter, just to piggyback on what Linda said, there's nothing impossible about imagining that victims of a genocide can later, 50, 70 years later, be involved in committing international crimes. I think the more interesting question that is at the heart of some of the criticisms of the ICJ case brought by South Africa is the question of selectivity and double standards. Why is South Africa suing Israel and not Sudan for committing genocide during Darfur? Where were they when Sudan was committing genocide in Darfur? Why aren't they suing Rwanda for committing genocide in the DRC? Why did they not sue Myanmar for the genocide against the Rohingya? And those are really good questions. And there's all sorts of issues about double standards. And I do think that the fact that Israel has been the focus of such intense pressure in certain UN organs is a result of double standards. So there's a kernel of truth to the idea that Israel gets undue attention. But I think the fact that that the Jews were once the victim of a Holocaust does not insulate them from any form of accountability when the Jewish state commits or is accused of committing international crimes.
And if I just one more thing, I think, this is also a question about the memory of the Holocaust itself, right? And the work that it is supposed to do in our society, which is to prevent this from ever being commissioned again. And I think what we have seen is that the memory of the Holocaust has been weaponized and manipulated. And for me, at least, kind of this involvement with this question comes from a desire to want to protect that memory, in fact, and its integrity, and the facts that we have, worked so hard to nail down, because we are all aware of how easily they can be undone. And indeed, anti-Semitism is on the rise again.
Let me move on. There's a bunch of questions. We have, I think, room for maybe one or two more questions. There's a bunch of questions about the differences between prosecuting individuals and prosecuting states. What the standards are, where the threshold is met for the state to be responsible as opposed to just individuals. And then maybe it's a different type of question, but another question about why it's so difficult to prosecute even individuals for the crime of genocide. Maybe I'll start with that question with Linda, since that's really, in many ways, the subject of your book.
Yeah, okay. But I'm not a practitioner, so I'm not a lawyer, which was one of my many mistakes in life. But
No. Sounds like a great achievement.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know. I think it's, to answer the difficulty question, right, it comes down to this question of intent, at least at the state level, right? And that's why I'm so interested. There is a petition right now before the ICJ pertaining to the Rohingya case to expand the definition of intent, to acknowledge that there are other kinds of crimes, crimes against children, crimes of mass sexual violence that justifiably could fall under the genocide definition. But I think law is a very conservative discipline. It's much, there's this famous line that, law does not need to recognize that 100,000 murders have taken place when it can recognize 1,000. So then, we from other disciplines, it's our duty to think about what happened to those that law could not see and that did not make it into the legal record, so to speak. Yeah, and I think, one of the great criticisms of the ICC is that it has, historically only gone after largely leaders from African nations and has failed to indict leaders from the West. And, we can talk about the ramifications of that for the reputation of the court.
In terms of the difference between prosecuting or bringing cases against states and bringing cases against individuals, if an individual is brought before a criminal court, whether it's a domestic court or an international court, they can only be convicted beyond a reasonable doubt. So it's much harder to convict individuals. To hold a state responsible, it's a lesser standard. It's not clear exactly what it is, but it's not quite as high a standard. But both of them, to build on what Linda said, both kinds of courts, the International Court of Justice, where Israel is being tried, and the International Criminal Court, where individuals are being tried, are conservative institutions. The ICJ has always been very skeptical about inventing new law, and they are very, very reluctant to interpret law in a progressive way. And the International Criminal Court and domestic criminal courts are conservative too, and they're conservative for a good reason. We have a principle in law that's called no crime without law, no penalty without law. There's a Latin term for that too. That is meant to protect defendants against retroactive punishment, against being tried for something that was not a crime when they committed it. And so criminal courts, domestically and internationally, and I guess I'm about to find out because I'm going to teach criminal law at the law school in the fall, God help me and God help my students, is about protecting defendants against misuse of the state's power. After all, a criminal defendant who's convicted is going to go to jail. And so this idea of a conservative approach is actually very much about protecting individuals against abuses by prosecutors and judges.
Do you want to answer?
Just maybe a brief addition. So, discussing the role of the state, in many cases of genocide, we can see that the role of the state is crucial. And analyzing the stages how genocide is committed, we can understand that without support organizing by the state, it's almost impossible, because not all discrimination in society led to genocide. Yeah. And for example, we have different schemes how genocide can be committed, and one of them is 10 stages, and it's starting from classification of people, symbolization, dehumanization, and it leads to extermination, and finally denial. So the extermination and mass killing is not final step in committing genocide. Denial of genocide is the final step. And in many cases, denial happened only years after, when government committed genocide, tried to hide all evidences, like it's happened in Ottoman Empire, and until today's discussion between official Turkey officials and Armenian officials, if it was Armenian genocide or it was deportation, just deportation, we have here both historical recognition events as a genocide problem, what's effect on international relation today, and also we should have mechanism, really working mechanism, understanding how we can prosecute contemporary criminals, because I return back to Russia, sorry. And what we can do with a country with nuclear weapon, how we can persecute the leaders of this country, how we can arrest them, to gather them and bring to the court room. In this case, we also see that they feel impunity at this moment, freely, and they even Russian leadership, they even weaponized and abused the genocide concept itself. So on the start of full-scale invasion, Russian leadership justified full-scale invasion by preventing genocide in the west of Ukraine committed by Ukrainians against the people of Donbass. So they even created the group, because it's no people of Donbass, it's Ukrainian people in western Ukrainian region. So it's like a lot of question what I can raise here, but yeah, as I said, it's both historical recognition, because many people who understand that genocide committed against their parents, grandparents, maybe they wanted to get satisfaction by recognizing some historical event as a genocide. But on the other hand, we have and faced with contemporary issues. Yeah.
We're almost out of time, got about 5 more minutes, but I want to read one more question and then turn it into a question of my own. It's not quite the question on the index card. But the question is, who decides on the naming of genocide, I presume, and when and how does that determination get adopted by others? Example, the US called government actions in Darfur as genocide, but not all countries have affirmatively called it genocide. And so I kind of want to use that question as an opportunity to move away from the law, and from the International Criminal Court and the International Court of Justice, and just to talk about the role that states have played in naming things genocide, like what Yuri was talking about. Really, who calls things genocide? Is the law the proper format in which to determine whether something is genocide? We can't have a criminal case about things that happened 100 years ago to think about the Armenian genocide, for instance, which there are still countries that deny that as genocide. What is the format? It also gets to the issue of lawyers and what lawyers can do. So is this a matter for law or is it a matter for historians, and what's the difference?
I can start. So,
well, you start,
yeah. We just recently discussed this with my students. Are you here, guys? Raise your hand. Yeah, some of you? Okay, good. So it's a concept of so-called memorial laws, and it's very popular in Europe, in the countries which are experiencing the totalitarian regimes, mass crimes. And on the legal level, in many European countries, some events historically recognized as a genocide, and in some cases it's a form of satisfaction for victims or their offsprings for these crimes. In some ways, it's led actually to material compensation, like in the case with the victims of Holocaust, and not only in the case with Jewish victims. Roma people in some countries in Europe or other victims of political prisoners and they also received some kind of compensation because this special laws were adopted. Yeah.
I think everybody gets to name it, and it's only in a certain number of rare instances can we judge at the time that it's clearly genocide. I think Rwanda and Bosnia were those cases that I've lived through. And that doesn't mean the international community did much to stop it from happening, but when it was happening, to me, it was clear that it was a genocide. But today, we have other cases around the world. I mean, they're still arguing about Armenia 100 years later, and we might be arguing about Gaza for another 50 years, and there may well be no authoritative answer until the historians have gotten a hold of all of the archives of the Israelis and the IDF and all sorts of other things. So I do think history, in most cases, is often the final judge.
Even we're not always right.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree. And I do think that it should be acknowledged that there was this kind of really productive and difficult debate over what genocide was and is, and that that's happening not only in the courts and not only in history in the seminar room, but also in the street. I think that's a meaningful contribution to what we think of when we think of genocide. And it's I think you have to acknowledge that its use in everyday speech also alters the meaning of the term, right? How we use it when we speak to one another outside of a court or outside of a peer-reviewed article, also, that is also the meaning of the term genocide. So yeah, I think we all get to name it. I think that's a nice way of putting it.
All right, well, thank you to the three of you for the conversation. Thank you to the audience for coming, and thanks.